I always thought the worst thing a person could do was walk away from you. I was wrong. The worst thing is when they stay close enough to poison your name and far enough to watch you crumble, silently, as everyone around you believes the false story they've told. If you could hear the things he said about me, everything he whispered, exaggerated, and outright fabricated, you might wonder how I even survived the humiliation, how I didn't scream at the world or collapse in the street. But there's something about betrayal that doesn't kill immediately. It burrows, slowly, like a parasite in your chest, making you doubt yourself, your memory, your instincts. He made me sound needy, desperate, unstable, a woman who couldn't survive without him. And the most maddening part, people believed him. Friends, colleagues, even family started questioning me. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. Those I had trusted for years seemed to treat me with polite caution, as if I were dangerous. Dangerous for what? Loving him too much? Caring too deeply? Or just being myself? I'll tell you now right at the start because you need to know. He didn't think I would fight back. He thought I would crumble under whispers and laughter and suspicion. He didn't realize that a woman like me, beautiful, strong, experienced, and proud, can turn every false word into fuel. The lies began small, a whisper here, a casual remark there. Someone would repeat it, and I would dismiss it. They probably misunderstood, I'd think. It's harmless. The first few lies weren't dangerous. They were easy to forgive because they seemed insignificant. But small lies grow if you ignore them. They multiply, they evolve. And soon, they can consume your life completely. That's exactly what he wanted. He was clever. Not the careless, obvious liar who gets caught in a single web. No, he was strategic, deliberate, and patient. He knew the right words to say to the right people at the right time. He studied me, learned my strengths and weaknesses, and then turned my kindness and patience into the narrative that served him best. He didn't just lie about me. He rewrote my life. I want you to imagine for a second what it feels like to have someone you trust be the one spreading stories about your flaws, exaggerating your emotions, twisting your intentions, and presenting you as unstable or manipulative. It's a unique kind of torture. You see yourself reflected in the eyes of others, distorted, unrecognizable, painted as the villain in a play you never auditioned for. Yet even as my world seemed to crack around me, a spark flickered inside. The spark whispered, "He's forgotten one thing. I am not powerless. I notice everything. I remember everything. And someday, the truth will speak louder than your lies." That day hadn't come yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it would arrive with the force of everything he had ever tried to bury. Every deceit, every smear, every whispered word meant to shame me. But before I get to that moment, before the satisfaction of seeing his carefully constructed image shatter in front of the people who once believed him, let me take you to the beginning. Let me show you who I was before the lies, before the whispers, before the humiliation. Because to understand how I survived and how I had the last laugh, you need to see the life he tried to erase. Before that, though, I want to ask you something. I want you to pause even just for a second and think, where are you watching this from? If this happened to you, would you have fought back? Would you have quietly planned, or would you have exploded in anger? I want you to leave your answers in the comments because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It's a cautionary tale for anyone who has ever trusted the wrong person. Now, take a deep breath. Let's go back to the beginning, to the life I had before he decided to make me his villain. Before all this, the lies, the whispers, the slow erosion of trust, I was a woman at peace with myself. At 52, I had grown into my body, my mind, and my spirit. I wasn't perfect, but I was strong, confident, and entirely aware of my worth. My children were grown, my career was stable, and I had carved out a life that was quiet, comfortable, and fully my own. I thought I had reached a point where I could breathe freely, enjoy my accomplishments, and simply exist without worrying about being misunderstood. I had always been independent. I had raised my children with care, juggling work, school events, and life's countless little emergencies. I had learned how to make the hard choices, the ones no one applauds but everyone benefits from. I knew my boundaries, my limitations, and my strengths. I had been through heartbreak, betrayal, and disappointment before, yet I had emerged resilient every single time. That resilience was a quiet armor I wore, one that made me cautious but also unshakable in my own reality. I loved my quiet life. I loved my routines. A slow morning coffee in the sun, a walk through my neighborhood, the occasional lunch with friends who truly mattered. I cherished these moments because they were mine. I had friends who respected me, colleagues who valued my expertise, and family who depended on my wisdom. I was known for being fair, approachable, and calm even when the world around me erupted into chaos. I thought I had built a protective bubble around myself. Little did I know that bubble would soon be pierced in the most unexpected way. He came into my life like a breeze, gentle, unassuming, and comforting. At first, I barely noticed him. He didn't arrive like a storm, demanding attention or creating upheaval. No, he entered softly, almost imperceptibly, the kind of presence that makes you think, maybe this is someone who will simply exist beside me without expecting anything more. He complimented me, admired my strength, and said the things most people leave unspoken. You carry yourself with dignity. Your laughter is contagious. You know who you are, and that's rare. These words made me feel seen, not like a woman in need, but like a person worthy of recognition. It wasn't long before I let him in, not in a reckless, dramatic way. I didn't tell him my darkest secrets immediately or hand over my life wholesale. I let him in gradually, through conversations, shared meals, walks, small moments of connection. I trusted him because he had never given me a reason not to. He respected my space, my time, my boundaries. I remember thinking, finally, someone who understands the beauty of letting a person be themselves without demanding more. At that point in my life, I had learned the art of patience. I had been burned before, by lovers, by colleagues, by friends I thought I could trust. I had learned that people reveal their true selves slowly, over time. I had learned to observe, to listen, to notice patterns, and yet, he managed to slip past my careful watchfulness. He was clever in his charm, subtle, thoughtful, the kind of man who seems harmless, even nurturing, until you realize the extent of the control he wields behind a smile. He complimented me on my appearance, not in a shallow way, but with sincerity. He noticed the way I carried myself, the way I spoke, the way I treated others. He told me I radiated confidence, and that my age made me all the more interesting, desirable, and wise. I believed him because it rang true. I had spent years cultivating my sense of self, learning to love the woman I had become. Hearing someone else appreciate that felt refreshing, like a balm I hadn't realized I needed. And so, I let my guard down, bit by bit. I laughed more freely. I shared my thoughts without hesitation. I told him stories about my past, my losses, my triumphs. I shared dreams I hadn't dared mention to anyone in years. I invited him into my world in ways I had never done with anyone else. And I believed, wholeheartedly, that what I was giving him was sacred, because I trusted him. What I didn't know then was that every detail, every vulnerability, every confidence I shared would eventually be turned against me. He didn't come into my life to love me in the way I understood love. He came to study me, learn my strengths and weaknesses, and find the exact places where my character could be twisted for his advantage. The very qualities I cherished in myself, my kindness, patience, confidence, and independence, were the same ones he would use to build his lies. I see it now clearly. But at the time, I was blissfully unaware. I was simply living, enjoying the moments, feeling safe in the life I had created. I was a woman who had survived storms before, and I thought that my calm, measured existence made me immune to manipulation. I couldn't have known that the calmest waters often hide the sharpest predators. Before he began his campaign of lies, before the whispers and gossip and quiet humiliation, I was whole, I was respected, I was confident, I was free. And that freedom, innocent, untainted, unthreatened, was exactly what he wanted to claim as his own, even if it meant destroying me to do so. So when the lies started, when the small comments, the rumors, and the misunderstandings first reached my ears, I didn't immediately realize the danger. I thought, they're exaggerating. He couldn't be so cruel. People must have misheard. But the first lie, no matter how small, planted a seed of doubt that would grow until it nearly consumed me. That's why understanding who I was before the lies is crucial, because the contrast is what made his betrayal so painful, so sharp. I went from a woman respected and admired to a woman whose name was whispered with suspicion. I went from calm confidence to quiet observation, from trust to meticulous planning. And that shift, the transformation forced upon me, was where the story truly begins. I had no idea then, as I sipped my morning coffee or walked through the sunlit streets of my neighborhood, that my life was about to be rewritten by someone who had mastered the art of subtle cruelty. But I also didn't know that the woman who had survived every hardship of life, who had built her identity on strength, patience, and wisdom, was about to reclaim everything he thought he could steal. And so the stage was set. My life, once serene and unquestioned, had become the battlefield of his lies. But little did he know, the woman he underestimated would be the one writing the final chapter. When he first came into my life, it didn't feel like a storm. It felt like a warm, gentle breeze, soft, comforting, and almost imperceptible. I never noticed how quickly he had become a constant presence, slipping seamlessly into my days and my routines, my thoughts. He didn't demand my attention, didn't create chaos, didn't make grand declarations of love or need. Instead, he quietly observed, waited, and learned how to appear indispensable without anyone, including me, realizing what he was doing. At first, I admired him. I admired his patience, the way he listened, the way he seemed to know exactly when to offer comfort without ever appearing intrusive. If I mentioned being tired, he would suddenly appear with a coffee or a warm meal. If I complained about a minor inconvenience, he had a way of solving it before I even fully acknowledged it. I thought it was kindness. I thought it was thoughtfulness. I thought it was love. He said all the right things. He complimented me without flattery. I admire how confident you are, he told me once. You don't try to be anyone other than yourself, and that's rare. He called my laughter contagious and my presence grounding. In those early months, I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in decades. Someone truly noticed me, not my accomplishments, not my status, not my appearance, but me, my essence. And so I began to let him in, slowly, cautiously, as I always do. I shared stories about my past, my triumphs, my heartbreaks. I talked about my children, my work, my fears, my dreams. I told him things I hadn't told anyone in years, feeling a strange mixture of relief and excitement that someone could hold these truths without judgment. He never pried, never pressed, never betrayed that trust, or so I thought. The danger, of course, is that when someone makes you feel safe, you lower your guard. You begin to trust them implicitly. And I did. I let him into spaces in my life that were private, sacred, and carefully protected. He became my confidant, my support, my sounding board. If I had a concern, he was there. If I needed advice, he was there. He became the person I turned to before anyone else, a silent partner in my life, whose presence seemed like a natural, comforting extension of my own world. I now realize how carefully he constructed this role. He didn't rush, he didn't demand, he didn't alarm me with grand gestures. Instead, he wove himself into my life like a thread in a tapestry, invisible yet essential. Every kind word, every small favor, every moment of attention was a way to study me, understand me, and gather information. And I, blinded by gratitude and trust, never noticed the weaving. He would listen to my fears and offer solutions, all while storing the details of my vulnerabilities. He asked questions I thought were natural curiosity, but they were really investigations. He complimented me in ways that made me feel appreciated, but they were also ways to understand what I valued and what could be used against me. He acted like a partner in my life, but in reality, he was quietly mapping out the spaces where he could manipulate, where he could control, where he could undermine me without detection. I remember telling myself repeatedly, he's kind, he's thoughtful, he just wants to help. I ignored the faintest inkling of doubt in my mind because it was easier to believe in goodness than to question it. I didn't see the subtle ways he began to plant ideas, not lies yet, just suggestions, little seeds of doubt and comparison. He would casually mention other women, other relationships, other opinions, and then gauge my reactions. It was clever, meticulous, and invisible to me at the time. By the time I began to notice the small inconsistencies, the tiny half-truths, the casual contradictions, I was already invested. My trust in him had grown too strong to doubt. I had let him into my world so completely that questioning him felt unnatural. It was as if I had built a house and invited him to decorate, only to realize later that he had been rearranging the foundation without my knowledge. Looking back now, I understand that love, or what I thought was love, had blinded me. It wasn't passion that I felt, it was comfort, safety, and attention. And he had mastered the art of providing just enough of each to make me feel secure while simultaneously gathering the ammunition he would later use. Every act of kindness, every compliment, every moment of apparent understanding was part of a larger strategy I didn't yet comprehend. I didn't notice the signs because I didn't want to. It's strange how you can sense danger but choose to ignore it, convinced that your instincts are wrong. I wanted to believe in his sincerity. I wanted to believe that someone could love me without ulterior motives. I clung to the narrative that I had always controlled my life, made wise choices, and could recognize character when I saw it. That confidence, ironically, became the very thing that allowed him to mislead me. By the time the first rumors started to reach my ears, I had already given him access to my life in ways that couldn't be undone. He had observed my habits, noted my routines, and learned how to predict my reactions. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to force anything. The groundwork had been laid, and the structure of manipulation was already complete. And yet, even amidst the growing shadows, I remained unaware. I continued to believe in his warmth, his attentiveness, and his affection. I mistook strategic attention for genuine care. I trusted his presence, not realizing that the same presence could later be used as evidence against me. I gave him the pieces of myself freely, unknowingly supplying him with the tools he would use to rewrite my character in the eyes of others. It is in this blindness that I learned the first painful lesson of betrayal. Sometimes the people who enter your life the gentlest are the ones who will cause the deepest wounds. They don't storm in, they weave themselves in so intricately that by the time you recognize the danger, it's already entangled you completely. And so, the relationship that once brought me comfort became the very lens through which my life would later be misrepresented. He had planted himself in my world with precision, patience, and subtlety, and I had welcomed him. The trust I offered became the foundation of the lies he would tell. The love I thought I had shared became the fuel for a story I hadn't even known was being written. It is only now, looking back, that I realize how carefully he had orchestrated every step. But in those early days, all I felt was warmth, appreciation, and a sense of companionship I hadn't known in years. That sense of security, that ease, was the trap that blinded me. And that blindness, sweet, comforting, and entirely unrecognized, would last far longer than I ever imagined. The first lie was almost imperceptible. It was a small comment, a whisper here and there, a subtle exaggeration of something I had said or done. At first I didn't notice it, or rather, I didn't want to. I told myself, it's nothing. People probably misheard, it'll pass. But lies are like seeds. Even the smallest one, left unchecked, can grow into something wild, uncontrollable, and toxic. It started with mutual friends. He would casually describe situations we had shared, subtly twisting the details. I remember one instance at a dinner party where he claimed that I had been furious over a trivial disagreement at work. She really lets things get to her, he said, laughing softly. The people around us nodded, murmuring their agreement. I froze, recognizing the story he had just invented. But when I tried to explain, he smiled. The perfect, disarming smile, and said, "They misunderstood. You know how people embellish." That was the first time I realized he could lie with ease, charm, and confidence, and that people were willing to believe him. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't violent, it was quiet, and it was effective. From that moment, I started noticing the pattern. Small comments here, a slight exaggeration there, until a narrative began to form. According to him, I was moody, overly sensitive, and occasionally manipulative. My words were always misrepresented, my intentions twisted. He painted me as the unstable one, the unreasonable one, the problem in every situation. And worse, he did it in a way that made him appear patient, kind, and heroic, suffering silently while dealing with my imagined volatility. I tried to confront him gently at first. I asked, "Why would you say that? Why twist my words?" He smiled, leaned in, and said softly, "It's not like that. They misunderstood, that's all. Don't take it personally." His voice was calm, soothing, almost convincing. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe the man I had trusted, the man who had shown me kindness, the man I had invited into my life. But as the small lies accumulated, I could no longer ignore the evidence. I began to hear whispers from people I had considered close. "Are you okay?" they asked. I heard, and then they trailed off, leaving the words unsaid but implied. The tone, the hesitation, the cautious glances, all indicated that the lies had taken root, and that's when panic began to creep in. Not for myself, I knew my own truth, but for the world that had been misled, the people who had already started to doubt me. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Friends started calling less frequently. Conversations felt guarded. Invitations became sparse. The very people who had once embraced me now seemed to tread carefully, as though one misstep could confirm the narrative he had created. And I, still stunned by the betrayal, felt the weight of isolation pressing down like a slow, relentless tide. The cruel irony was that he didn't need to lie loudly. He didn't need to shout or argue. He simply needed to be believable. And he was. His charm, his seeming sincerity, and his careful timing made every small lie seem plausible. Each whisper he created reinforced the next, building a chain of falsehoods that I couldn't yet see fully, but which was slowly strangling my reputation. I remember one afternoon sitting alone in my living room, staring at my phone, realizing how effectively he had begun to manipulate perception. I had trusted him completely, confided in him, shared my vulnerabilities, and in return he had weaponized those very details. Every moment I had thought was intimate, safe, and genuine, he had been collecting pieces of ammunition. It was a calculated, cold, and deliberate strategy. And yet, amidst the rising panic, I felt something else, something unexpected, a spark. A recognition that while the small lies were starting to take effect, they were also revealing the truth of his character. I could see how he operated. I could see the pattern. I could anticipate his moves. And in that awareness, I began to plan, not out of vengeance at that moment, but out of self-preservation. I began documenting everything, not aggressively, not in a confrontational way, but quietly, meticulously. Each small lie, each exaggerated story, each twisted retelling of my words went into a notebook. Names, dates, details, and the subtle context of how the lie was delivered. At first, it felt obsessive, even paranoid, but in truth, it was necessary. The small lies were just the beginning, and I needed to prepare for the inevitable escalation. The most insidious part of these early lies was their subtlety. They were never blatant enough to confront head-on. I couldn't accuse him publicly without appearing defensive, emotional, or even unstable, the very labels he was beginning to attach to me. Instead, I had to watch, absorb, and learn. I had to understand the scope of his manipulation before I could respond, and in that patience, I found clarity. By the time I fully grasped the pattern, the small lies had already done their work. People were questioning me. He had planted seeds of doubt that would grow if left unchecked. But I refused to panic. I refused to lash out. I realized that every small lie he told was also a key that could be used to unlock the truth if handled wisely. And that's exactly what I decided to do. I would let the lies continue, silently, but I would collect evidence, observe behavior, and prepare my response. I would remain calm, composed, and patient. Because in my experience, the most effective way to counter deception is not with anger or confrontation, but with meticulous strategy and undeniable truth. The first small lies were the warning. They were the test, the prelude, the quiet signal that he was capable of far greater deceit. But they also gave me the time I needed to understand, prepare, and ultimately plan for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. And that moment, though invisible then, was approaching. The first signs of betrayal were subtle, almost imperceptible. They didn't arrive as dramatic confrontations or loud accusations. No, they came quietly, slipping into everyday moments, leaving me unsettled but unsure why. I began to notice slight shifts in how people spoke to me, the way they glanced briefly before looking away, the soft hesitations in conversations I had once taken for granted. At first, I blamed myself. Perhaps I had misread a tone or overanalyzed a gesture, but deep down, I knew something was changing. It started with friends I had known for years. They began asking strange questions about my life, phrasing them in ways that implied doubt or suspicion. "Are you really okay?" one would ask. "I just want to make sure I understand," another would say. Their words were laced with concern, yet concern tinged with uncertainty. They were trying to reconcile the version of me they had always known with the subtle distortions he had introduced. And the hardest part? They didn't know the source of these doubts. I remember the first evening I realized how deep this was beginning to sink in. I was hosting a casual dinner at my home, a small gathering of close friends. Everything was normal, or at least it seemed so. We laughed, shared stories, and talked about work and family. And then, in the middle of the conversation, he casually made a comment about me. Nothing major, just a small exaggeration of a disagreement I had had at work. The people around me chuckled softly, nodding as though it were true. My heart sank. I felt it immediately, the shift in energy, the subtle questioning in their eyes. I tried to laugh along, to dismiss it, but the unease remained. After the dinner, one of my friends pulled me aside. "I'm not sure what to think," she whispered. "I heard some things. I don't know if it's true, but people are talking." My stomach tightened and I forced a smile. "It's probably just a misunderstanding," I said. But inside, I felt a cold, creeping fear that my world was beginning to tilt on its axis. The lies he told were never direct attacks. They were insinuations, carefully placed, small enough to seem harmless, yet powerful enough to shape perception. I began noticing patterns, the way he would tell a story and emphasize certain words, the way he would casually leave out key details, the way he framed me as emotional, difficult, or volatile. People believed him because he presented everything with confidence, charm, and subtle humor. He didn't need to shout or insist, he only needed to be persuasive. And persuasive he was. The first signs of betrayal also came in how he treated me privately versus publicly. In private, he was attentive, patient, and seemingly concerned. But in social settings, he subtly undermined me, planting small doubts in the minds of those around us. He would mention past incidents I had handled responsibly, twisting them to suggest recklessness or overreaction. He would comment on my behavior in ways that seemed innocuous, but by the time the conversation ended, the seed of doubt had already been sown. I remember a moment at a small family gathering that cut deeper than I expected. He told a story about an argument I had had at work, framing it as a public display of temper. Relatives who had once respected me looked confused, uncertain. I tried to correct the narrative gently, but he interrupted smoothly, charmingly, and the room nodded with him. I felt my face heat up, a mix of embarrassment, disbelief, and frustration. For the first time, I truly understood the power of subtle manipulation. It didn't have to be loud to be effective. Even as these moments accumulated, I refused to confront him immediately. I knew that doing so too early would appear defensive, irrational, or overly emotional, the very labels he was trying to attach to me. Instead, I began documenting every interaction, every comment, every slight distortion of my words or actions. I started keeping notes, small reminders, and mental observations. I paid close attention to his mannerisms, the way he phrased things, the pauses in conversation that often preceded a subtle twist of truth. The first signs of betrayal also revealed a pattern in the people around him. Those who had once treated me with trust and respect were now tentative. Invitations became less frequent. Conversations felt measured, careful, as though a single word could tip the balance of perception. I felt isolated, not because people abandoned me, but because the invisible pressure of doubt had begun to shift their interactions. I was still present, still engaged, but subtly mistrusted. I realized that betrayal doesn't always announce itself with a bang. Often it begins quietly, in small moments that seem inconsequential at first. A single comment, a soft glance, a whispered conversation. All of these can combine to create a narrative that is far more damaging than any overt accusation. He had mastered this art, and I, caught off guard, was already entangled in it. Yet even as I felt the sting of betrayal, a quiet determination began to rise within me. I understood that the first signs were not the end, they were the beginning. They were proof of his skill, yes, but also proof that he could be observed, anticipated, and ultimately exposed. I began planning, not with vengeance yet, but with meticulous care. I knew that patience and evidence would become my allies, and that reacting impulsively could only play into his hands. By the time the first signs of betrayal fully revealed themselves, I was no longer naive. I had been warned. I had seen the pattern emerge, and though my heart ached from the realization that someone I had trusted so deeply could manipulate my world so subtly, I also felt the stirrings of a plan, a quiet, patient, deliberate preparation for the day when the truth would finally be mine to control. Because betrayal, I learned, is not only a test of endurance, it is a test of strategy, and I was determined to pass. By the time the lies began to escalate, I had already learned to observe him with a careful, watchful eye. The whispers that once seemed small and harmless had grown louder, more persistent, and far more insidious. People who had once trusted me were now questioning my intentions. My character was under silent attack, and the quiet battlefield I had been navigating was about to become far more treacherous. It started with rumors that weren't just exaggerated, they were designed to isolate me. Colleagues questioned my judgment at work. Friends hesitated before inviting me to gatherings. Even distant family members looked at me with suspicion, unsure whether to trust the version of events I presented. The small lies had become a network of manipulation, each thread carefully woven to trap me in a web of doubt and mistrust. One evening, I received a call from someone I had considered a close friend for over 20 years. Her voice was tentative, almost apologetic. "I don't want to believe it," she said, "but I heard some things about you and him. People are talking, and I'm not sure what's true." My stomach sank. The network of lies he had spun was working. He had managed to infiltrate the perceptions of even those I trusted most. The danger wasn't just social, it was professional, emotional, and psychological. He had created a world where every action I took could be interpreted as proof of instability or deceit. The more I tried to defend myself, the more it seemed to confirm his narrative in the minds of others. I quickly realized that confronting him directly at this stage would not only be ineffective, it could be catastrophic. His lies were strategic, deliberate, and insidiously persuasive. One night, I found myself alone in my living room, a notebook open before me. I had begun recording every detail, every inconsistency, every subtle misrepresentation of my words, names, dates, contexts, and the exact phrasing of his comments, all carefully documented. I was building a map of deceit, a comprehensive record of manipulation that could one day expose him. The realization hit me like a cold wave. If I didn't act methodically, he could destroy me completely. And he wasn't subtle in his cruelty anymore. What had begun as quiet insinuations and small distortions escalated into direct attempts to control the narrative. He would make casual remarks to mutual acquaintances, framing me as emotional, reactive, or untrustworthy. He began to exaggerate arguments we had, twisting them into evidence of instability. He didn't need confrontation. He didn't need conflict. All he needed was persuasion, timing, and an audience willing to believe his carefully crafted story. I remember one particularly chilling moment. I had attended a professional meeting, and he, by chance or design, was present. He casually mentioned an incident from months ago, framing it as proof that I had been reckless and unreliable. Colleagues who had once respected my competence exchanged glances, their expressions betraying doubt. My heart pounded. I had never felt so powerless, watching my credibility erode in real time, manipulated by someone I had allowed so close to my life. It was at that point I realized the stakes had shifted. This was no longer a matter of social discomfort or emotional manipulation. This was dangerous. His lies could affect my career, my relationships, and my reputation permanently. and he was enjoying it, his calm, confident demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos he was orchestrating around me. But in that realization, a new resolve emerged. I was not powerless. I would not allow his lies to define my reality. I began to strategize, thinking several steps ahead. If he was going to manipulate perception, I would counter with undeniable truth. If he was going to distort reality, I would gather evidence, witnesses, and documentation to dismantle every falsehood he had created. The first step was patience. I could not act impulsively. Every move I made had to be calculated, deliberate, and precise. Reacting emotionally would only provide him with more opportunities to twist the story in his favor. Instead, I focused on observation, noting every pattern, every manipulation tactic, every subtle maneuver he used to influence those around us. I also began to test the waters, planting small truths in conversations to gauge reactions. Who believed the lies unquestioningly? Who could be reminded of the truth without skepticism? These interactions were subtle, careful experiments, each one helping me understand the scope of his influence and the most effective way to counteract it. Meanwhile, the emotional toll was heavy. I felt isolated, betrayed, and at times deeply frustrated. It was exhausting to remain composed while watching him erode the trust and respect I had spent decades building. But I reminded myself constantly, he underestimated me. He had overlooked one crucial truth. I am observant, patient, and resilient. I am not easily defeated, and I never forget who I am. In the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I planned. Every lie he told became part of a dossier in my mind. Every casual misrepresentation became an opportunity to expose the reality behind his facade. And with each observation, my confidence grew, not in vengeance, but in the knowledge that the truth, once revealed, would be unstoppable. By the time the lies turned dangerous, I was no longer merely reacting. I was preparing. Preparing for the moment when the web he had spun would entangle him instead of me. Preparing for the moment when the people who had doubted me would see the truth clearly. Preparing for the day when his carefully constructed image would crumble under the weight of reality. The lies had escalated. The betrayal had deepened. And I, too, had transformed. I was no longer naive. I was vigilant, strategic, and ready. The first signs of danger had been a warning. The lies that followed were the proof of his audacity, and I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that every small move he made would eventually lead him to the point of reckoning. The moment had not arrived yet, but it was coming, and when it did, I would be ready. Once I realized the lies had escalated into something dangerous, I knew I had to act, but not impulsively. Impulse would play into his hands, and he was too clever to leave anything to chance. I needed a plan, a careful strategy, and above all, evidence. Solid, undeniable proof that could counter every distortion, every whisper, every casual lie he had planted. I began quietly, very quietly. Not a single person could know what I was doing. Even the thought of suspicion had to be avoided because if he caught on, he would alter his behavior, cover his tracks, or escalate in unpredictable ways. This was no longer about simply defending myself. This was about reclaiming control, about turning the narrative back in my favor before it was too late. Every conversation, every story, every exaggerated or twisted detail had to be documented. I kept meticulous notes, dates, times, the exact words spoken, and the context. I noted who was present, what reactions followed, and how he framed the events. Every small lie, every insinuation, every manipulation became a piece of evidence that would one day expose the truth. I also began to observe him more carefully than ever before. Where he went, who he spoke to, what topics he raised, and even the subtleties of his tone, all of it was valuable. He believed he was invisible in his manipulations, that no one could see the patterns he had so carefully created. I made it my mission to see everything. In addition to documenting him, I started to create a network of allies without revealing my intentions. I reached out subtly to those who had been around for years, people whose judgment I trusted, asking questions indirectly, planting seeds of curiosity. I never told them the full story, just enough to test their perceptions and loyalty. Slowly, I began to rebuild trust, while simultaneously gathering support for the moment when the truth would be revealed. Technology became an unlikely ally. Emails, messages, and digital footprints allowed me to cross-reference his claims with reality. If he said something had happened one way, I could check dates, texts, or records to prove otherwise. Every inconsistency, every fabricated detail became a bullet in my arsenal. I didn't need confrontation yet. I needed proof, and proof I knew would be unstoppable. The quiet collection of evidence also served another purpose. It gave me perspective. Each documented lie and manipulation revealed the extent of his strategy and his arrogance. He had assumed that his control over perception was complete, that no one could see through the charming mask he wore. But I saw it. I was no longer the naive woman who had welcomed him into her life without question. I was vigilant, methodical, and deliberate. There were moments when gathering evidence felt exhausting, emotionally draining. I had to remain calm while recording everything, observing everything, calculating every move. There were nights I lay awake, replaying conversations in my mind, noting inconsistencies, imagining future confrontations. It was mentally and emotionally taxing. But I reminded myself constantly, patience now would yield victory later. The lies were dangerous, but they were also revealing. I also started noticing patterns in his behavior. He relied on charm to deflect suspicion, used subtle humor to disarm criticism, and leveraged his social skills to manipulate perception. But his methods were predictable. Each manipulation followed a pattern. Each exaggeration had a rhythm. Once I recognized these patterns, I could anticipate his moves and counteract them without revealing my own strategy. Gathering evidence quietly wasn't just about documentation. It was about control. The lies had shifted the balance of power, but by observing, recording, and analyzing, I began to reclaim it. I became the silent architect of my own defense, constructing a framework that would one day dismantle his carefully orchestrated deception. There were days when it felt almost impossible. He was everywhere, present in social gatherings, in work circles, even in casual interactions. Every smile, every casual remark, every playful jab had to be analyzed for intent and accuracy. I became hyper-aware, constantly evaluating, cross-checking, and strategizing. But in that meticulous vigilance, I found strength. I was no longer just surviving, I was preparing to triumph. At times, I even used subtle provocations to test him. I would mention trivial events or slight discrepancies in our past interactions, watching how he responded. Did he get defensive? Did he over-explain? Did he attempt to redirect the narrative? Each reaction was a clue. Another piece of the puzzle that allowed me to map his tactics and anticipate his next moves. Even as I gathered evidence, I maintained my calm exterior. To the outside world, I was composed, unaffected, and perhaps even unaware. This was intentional. He could not suspect that I was quietly amassing the tools to expose him. Every observation, every note, every piece of proof was a silent counterattack, invisible until the moment it would strike with full force. The quiet collection of evidence also gave me confidence. The lies, which once threatened to destabilize me, were now my guide. Each falsehood revealed his weaknesses, his patterns, and most importantly, his underestimation of me. He believed I would crumble under pressure, that I would react impulsively or emotionally. But I had learned, from years of experience, that patience and preparation were far more powerful than immediate retaliation. By the time I felt ready to act, I had a comprehensive understanding of his manipulations, a detailed record of every deceit, and a strategy that was both precise and methodical. I knew how the web of lies had been constructed, who had been influenced, and exactly how to expose him without giving him a chance to twist the narrative again. Gathering evidence quietly had transformed me. The woman who had once been blindsided by subtle manipulations had become observant, strategic, and patient. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. And when the time came, when the truth would finally emerge, he would not have a single tool to defend himself, because every lie he had told, every subtle twist of reality had been recorded. Every deception had a counter, and every whisper of doubt had a source. I had turned his strategy against him, silently, deliberately, and methodically. And that moment, the moment when lies would be exposed and truth would triumph, was approaching. The tipping point arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its impact was immediate and undeniable. It wasn't a single confrontation, not yet. It was a culmination of everything. The whispers, the distortions, the lies, and the subtle manipulation that had been building for months. The web he had spun around me had grown dense and suffocating, and suddenly it became clear that I could no longer wait. I first noticed it at work, in a meeting with colleagues I had trusted for years. He had inserted himself into a discussion about a project I was leading, subtly reframing my decisions in a negative light. At first, I thought I could navigate it smoothly. I could respond calmly, clarify, and set the record straight. But as the meeting progressed, I saw the subtle nods, the raised eyebrows, the micro-reactions that told me the seed of doubt he had planted had taken root. It wasn't just about perception anymore. It was about power, his power to influence, control, and isolate. He had crossed the line from whispering small lies to actively manipulating how people understood reality. And while part of me still hoped for reconciliation, part of me knew that this was the moment where action was necessary. The tipping point had arrived, and with it, the realization that patience and preparation alone were no longer enough. I remember leaving that meeting with a strange mix of emotions: anger, fear, frustration, and a growing sense of determination. I realized that the stakes had escalated to the point where inaction was dangerous. If I continued to allow him to manipulate the truth unchecked, the consequences would be devastating, not just to my reputation, but to my relationships, my career, and my very sense of self. That evening, I sat in my living room reviewing my meticulous records. Every note, every documented lie, every subtle distortion was carefully organized. I had evidence of the manipulations, patterns of behavior, and witness accounts. I had built a quiet arsenal, and now it was time to consider the strategy for using it. But strategy alone wasn't enough. I needed clarity, focus, and precision. Every move had to be calculated. Every step had to anticipate his reactions. The first tipping point wasn't just external, it was internal. I had reached a point where I could no longer tolerate the erosion of my life and the manipulation of my identity. I had to confront the truth of his character and my own resilience. The moment demanded courage, but not reckless courage, measured, deliberate, and unwavering. I began to test him subtly, planting questions and statements in conversation to gauge his reactions. How would he respond if someone confronted him indirectly? Did he falter under pressure, even slightly? Each interaction revealed more about his methods, his confidence, and his vulnerabilities. I realized that while he was skilled in deception, he was also predictable. Every lie, every manipulation had a pattern, and patterns can be exploited. It was during one of these subtle tests that I saw a crack in his armor. He had just recounted a story to mutual friends, embellishing details about an argument we supposedly had. I listened carefully, noting the exaggerations, the omissions, and the way he framed me as irrational and volatile. But this time, instead of letting it slide, I asked a calm, pointed question. I'm curious, did you consider how this aligns with what actually happened? His reaction was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it revealed his discomfort. The tipping point was not just external, it was manifesting in him as well. That evening, I reflected on how far I had come. The first small lies had evolved into a dangerous pattern of manipulation, yet I had grown stronger, more observant, and more strategic. I was no longer the woman blindsided by charm and deceit. I had anticipated the tipping point, prepared for it, and recognized it the moment it arrived. The power dynamic was shifting, and I was ready to take control. The tipping point also marked a critical moment of emotional clarity. I felt the full weight of betrayal, the sting of manipulation, and the isolation that came with it. But alongside those emotions, there was a growing sense of empowerment. I realized that the very lies designed to weaken me had inadvertently strengthened me. Each falsehood had sharpened my observation, honed my patience, and solidified my resolve. I began to see the path forward. The tipping point had provided clarity. I would no longer be passive. I would act, but with precision. I would gather allies, present evidence, and expose the truth in a way that could not be denied or twisted. He had underestimated me, and that underestimation would be his undoing. I also realized that timing was everything. Acting too soon would be reckless. Acting too late would allow him to tighten his grip. The tipping point had shown me exactly when and how to strike. I would use the momentum generated by the lies he had told, turning his own manipulations against him. The people who had been swayed by his narratives would see the truth, and the consequences of his deceit would be undeniable. In the days following the realization of the tipping point, I refined my strategy. I organized my evidence, rehearsed how I would present it, and anticipated possible objections or counter-narratives. Every lie he had told was cataloged, every manipulation noted, every witness prepared. The tipping point had not just revealed the urgency of action, it had illuminated the path to resolution. By the time the first confrontation occurred, I was no longer reactive. I was deliberate, calm, and unflinching. The tipping point had transformed me from a woman who had once been blindsided into a strategist, poised to reclaim her life. I had waited, observed, and prepared. Now I was ready to step out of the shadows of doubt and deception and into the clarity of truth. The tipping point, I realized, was not just about the lies he had told or the danger he had posed. It was about my own transformation. The moment had forced me to confront betrayal, manipulation, and deceit, and to emerge stronger, wiser, and more determined. The tipping point was both a warning and an opportunity, and I was ready to seize it. Because from this point forward, nothing would remain hidden, nothing would go unchallenged, and the truth, finally, would prevail. The tipping point had revealed everything I needed to know. The lies, the manipulations, the subtle network of doubt he had spun around me. But knowing was not enough. Observation and evidence were essential, yes, but they had to be paired with a plan. I could no longer simply react. I had to act, and I had to act strategically. The confrontation would be precise, deliberate, and irreversible. I began by reviewing my meticulously collected evidence. Every misrepresentation, every distortion, every lie was documented with dates, times, witnesses, and context. I read through the notes again and again, absorbing the details, analyzing patterns, and imagining the best way to present each piece. My goal wasn't to overwhelm people with anger or emotion. It was to reveal undeniable truth, brick by brick, with precision and clarity. The plan required patience, and I knew that confronting him directly without preparation would be disastrous. He thrived on improvisation, charm, and manipulation. He could twist even a direct accusation into an opportunity to victimize himself and paint me as irrational. Every word, every pause, every movement would have to be calculated. There was no room for error. I mapped out the confrontation like a chess game. Who would be present? How would I structure the discussion? Which points would I introduce first, and which would be held in reserve to counter potential deflections? I imagined his reactions, rehearsed my responses, and anticipated every possible excuse or redirection. This was not a spontaneous moment. It was a meticulously crafted strategy designed to dismantle the facade he had built. At the same time, I prepared my emotional armor. The first confrontation would not be easy. The sight of him, the casual confidence in his demeanor, the very memory of his manipulations, all of it had the potential to provoke anger, fear, or doubt. I reminded myself constantly, remain calm, controlled, and collected. Emotional displays would only serve his narrative, while composure would strengthen mine. I also prepared my allies carefully. Friends and colleagues who had been subtly observing or who had noticed inconsistencies were approached with discretion. I shared pieces of evidence only when necessary and gauged their reactions. Their support would be crucial, but it had to be earned, not forced. The confrontation was mine to execute, but allies would ensure the narrative could not be rewritten in the aftermath. Timing was everything. I watched him, noting his routines, his engagements, and moments of vulnerability. I wanted the confrontation to occur when he was most likely to be contained, unable to manipulate the environment or audience. I needed a setting that was controlled, neutral, and respectful. places where facts would speak louder than charm or persuasion. While planning, I reflected on the emotional journey that had brought me here. The small lies, the subtle manipulations, the growing danger, they had all been stepping stones to this moment. The betrayal had been painful, isolating, and infuriating, yet it had also sharpened my perception, strengthened my resolve, and honed my strategy. I was no longer the woman who had been blindsided. I was deliberate, vigilant, and unstoppable. Every detail of the confrontation was rehearsed in my mind. I visualized introducing each piece of evidence calmly, stating the facts clearly, and responding to denials with precision. I imagined his initial charm, the way he might attempt to redirect, and the subtle ways he might try to confuse witnesses. For each scenario, I crafted a counter, ensuring there would be no opening for manipulation. I also considered the emotional impact on him. This was not about revenge, it was about truth. But truth, when revealed with precision and clarity, carries its own power. He would feel exposed, stripped of control, and unable to deflect. His credibility, carefully constructed over months, would crumble in the face of undeniable evidence, and I would watch as the reality of his actions finally became clear to those who had once been swayed by his lies. Preparation extended beyond evidence and timing. I also honed my own narrative, refining the way I would present my experiences, feelings, and observations. The story I told had to be coherent, compelling, and undeniable. Every word, every pause, every emphasis was chosen carefully to ensure clarity and impact. I could not allow room for misinterpretation or manipulation. This was my truth, and it had to be unassailable. As the day approached, my confidence grew. The meticulous planning, the careful observation, and the patient gathering of evidence had created a framework that was virtually foolproof. I was no longer at the mercy of his manipulations. I had reclaimed control. The confrontation would be decisive, and the outcome would be determined by facts, not charm or deceit. And yet I felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. The confrontation would be intense, emotional, and possibly transformative. I knew that once it began, there would be no turning back. But I reminded myself, the tipping point had been reached. The lies had escalated, the danger had grown, and the time for preparation was over. It was now time to act. I took one final step before the confrontation, mental rehearsal. Alone in my living room, I visualized the encounter, imagining every detail, every word, every possible reaction. I pictured myself calm, assertive, and unyielding. I pictured the evidence laid out clearly, witnesses confirming the facts, and the truth becoming undeniable. Each visualization strengthened my resolve, sharpened my focus, and prepared me for the moment when the strategy would shift from planning to execution. The confrontation was more than a culmination of months of careful observation. It was a test of patience, strategy, and personal strength. Every lie, every manipulation, every subtle distortion had prepared me for this moment, and I was ready. Because from this point forward, the truth would no longer be hidden, and the control he had once wielded over my life would finally be returned to me. The confrontation was coming, and it would be decisive. The day of the confrontation arrived, and with it, a strange mix of anticipation, tension, and resolve. I had planned every detail meticulously, and now it was time to put everything into action. I reminded myself constantly, remain calm, precise, and unwavering. This was not about emotion or vengeance. It was about truth, clarity, and reclaiming control. I chose the location carefully, a neutral space where there would be no distractions, no opportunities for him to manipulate the setting or the people around us. It had to be controlled, public enough to prevent outbursts, private enough to allow focus. Everything was arranged with precision. The order of presentation, the witnesses, the documentation. There would be no improvisation, no room for error. As he arrived, I noted his demeanor. Confident, charming, unassuming, the mask he had worn for months. He had no idea what was coming. I greeted him calmly, keeping my voice neutral, my expressions composed. Inside, however, my senses were heightened. Every glance, every movement, every word he spoke was being carefully recorded. analyzed, and prepared for response. I began with the smallest lies, the ones that had first unsettled me. I presented them calmly, fact by fact, detailing how he had manipulated perceptions subtly and repeatedly. I watched as his eyes flickered, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. But I had noticed, even the most composed mask can falter when confronted with undeniable truth. I introduced witnesses strategically, people who had observed his distortions or inconsistencies without knowing the full extent of his manipulations. Their confirmation added weight to each claim, solidifying the narrative I was presenting. Step by step, lie by lie, the pattern became clear. The web he had spun over months was visible, undeniable, and systematically exposed. He attempted his usual deflections, his casual charm, the half-smiles and smooth explanations he had perfected over time. But I was ready. Every response had been anticipated, every excuse accounted for. I countered calmly, presenting facts, documentation, and corroborating statements. The room remained composed, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, his confidence began to waver. I could see it in his eyes, the subtle shift from control to uncertainty. The charisma he had relied upon so heavily began to crumble. For the first time, the reality of his actions was visible, reflected in the reactions of those around him. People who had once doubted me now listened attentively, nodding, absorbing the truth. The small lies that had once seemed harmless were now revealed in full context, stripped of subtlety and exposed for what they truly were: manipulation. The confrontation reached its most intense moment when I presented the larger patterns, the cumulative evidence of his deceit. Dates, messages, accounts of witnesses, and documented inconsistencies left no room for denial. I maintained my composure, carefully pacing each revelation to ensure maximum clarity and impact. This was no longer a personal attack, it was an exposition of truth. I noticed a subtle panic creeping into his demeanor. His usual calm, measured responses faltered. He tried to charm, to distract, to redirect, but the strategy I had prepared was airtight. Each tactic he attempted was neutralized by preemptive evidence and corroboration. The lies that had once controlled perception were unraveling before my eyes, exposing the reality he had tried to hide. There were moments when I felt a surge of vindication, not the vindictive satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet power of reclaiming control and asserting truth. Every detail I had documented, every note I had taken, every subtle observation had built to this moment, and now each revelation landed precisely as intended, dismantling the narrative he had carefully constructed over months. He attempted one final appeal: charm, humor, and plausible explanations, but it was too late. The audience was no longer swayed by mere words. The truth, systematically presented, had taken root. His credibility, once seemingly untouchable, was crumbling under the weight of facts. I watched, calm and measured, as the reality of his deception became undeniable. I allowed silence to follow key revelations, letting the weight of evidence settle. Silence, I had learned, is a powerful tool. It gives the audience time to process, reflect, and internalize the truth. He fidgeted, uncomfortable in the space he could no longer dominate. Every pause emphasized the contrast between fact and fiction, truth and manipulation. By the end of the confrontation, the transformation was complete. The web of lies he had spun was exposed, thread by thread. Witnesses who had been uncertain were now convinced. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by the visible realization that his manipulation had failed. And I, once isolated and undermined, had regained authority over my narrative, my reputation, and my life. I left the room with a calm sense of resolution. The confrontation had been executed precisely as planned. No outbursts, no emotional eruptions, no chance for misinterpretation. The evidence had spoken, and the truth had triumphed. I felt the weight of months of careful planning lift, replaced by a quiet empowerment. Later, I reflected on the journey, the small lies, the initial manipulations, the subtle betrayals, and the danger that had once threatened to overwhelm me. Each moment had prepared me for this confrontation. Each deception had revealed weaknesses that could be exploited, and each challenge had strengthened my resolve. The first confrontation was not the end, it was the decisive turning point. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity and control. The tipping point, the careful gathering of evidence, and the meticulously planned confrontation had all come together perfectly. I had reclaimed my power, exposed the truth, and ensured that his lies could no longer control perception. And yet, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Truth, once revealed, has its own momentum, but vigilance remains necessary. There may be further manipulations, subtle attempts to regain influence, or echoes of past lies, but I was ready, prepared, and determined. The first confrontation had set the stage, and now the final acts could unfold. I had faced betrayal, deception, and manipulation, and emerged stronger, wiser, and in control. The first confrontation had proven one essential truth: lies may grow quietly, but truth, once systematically revealed, is unstoppable. The confrontation was over, but the fallout had only just begun. The room that had once seemed neutral now felt charged with tension, the air thick with the weight of truth. People who had been uncertain, hesitant, or misled now looked at him differently. Their expressions revealed surprise, disbelief, and in many cases, shame for having doubted me. The small lies that had once seemed harmless had now exploded into undeniable consequences. The immediate aftermath was almost surreal. He had been exposed, and yet he tried, as always, to maintain composure. His charm, which had so often disarmed others, faltered under the evidence I had presented. Every misrepresentation, every twisted story, every subtle manipulation had been cataloged and countered, leaving him unable to continue weaving his narrative. I watched him, calm and composed, as the truth settled in like a slow-moving tide, reshaping the perceptions of everyone present. Even those who had once been loyal to him began to see the pattern. Friends who had doubted me approached cautiously, their eyes filled with apology and recognition. Colleagues who had questioned my judgment now sought clarification, eager to understand the reality of the situation. The fallout was not just social, it was emotional, professional, and psychological. His credibility, carefully built over months, was now fractured. In the days that followed, the consequences of the confrontation rippled outward. Mutual friends who had been unaware of the depth of his deceit began to reassess their own perceptions. Conversations that had once carried subtle doubt now turned toward understanding, validation, and support. I received messages from people who had been silent observers, expressing relief that the truth had finally come to light. The subtle isolation I had once felt was now replaced with connection, trust, and respect. Even so, the fallout was complex. Exposure of deceit rarely comes without resistance. He attempted minor retorts, casual denials, and attempts at justification. But each attempt was met with evidence, witness testimony, or simple factual clarity. The power he had relied upon, the manipulation of perception, was gone. Each attempt to reclaim control only emphasized the reality of his exposure. I found myself reflecting on the emotional journey that had brought me here. The initial whispers, subtle manipulations, and small lies had felt like minor irritations at first. Over time, however, they became a network of deception capable of destabilizing my life. But through patient observation, meticulous documentation, and strategic planning, I had transformed the situation into an opportunity to reclaim power and assert the truth. The fallout, I realized, was the inevitable consequence of facing deception with courage and preparation. One particularly revealing moment occurred during a gathering of mutual friends. He attempted to retell a story, framing it in his usual way, but I calmly interjected, presenting corroborating evidence and highlighting inconsistencies in his narrative. The group's reaction was immediate. Subtle disbelief turned to attentive listening, and finally, to recognition. He faltered, unable to maintain the narrative, and for the first time, I witnessed him confronted with the collective acknowledgement of truth. The emotional impact of the fallout was profound. Those who had doubted me experienced the discomfort of realizing they had been misled, while I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice, not revenge, but clarity. The subtle tension in relationships shifted, recalibrated by the undeniable presentation of fact, and People who had once questioned my character now approached with respect, support, and even apology. The fallout, in many ways, had strengthened bonds that had been strained by deception. I also noticed a shift within myself. The careful planning, the patient observation, and the strategic confrontation had not only exposed the lies, but had reinforced my own resilience. I felt stronger, more confident, and more aware of my own ability to navigate deceit and manipulation. The fallout was not merely a social adjustment. It was a reaffirmation of my strength, intelligence, and capacity for measured action. There were, of course, lingering effects. Some relationships remained cautious, trust required time to rebuild, and the memory of manipulation lingered. But even these challenges were manageable, mitigated by the clarity of evidence and the decisiveness of the confrontation. The fallout was complex, layered, and ongoing, but it was grounded in reality, truth, and careful preparation, elements that could not be undone. I also took time to reflect on his behavior during the fallout. For someone who had relied so heavily on charm and subtle influence, the exposure of deceit was devastating. His attempts to regain credibility were transparent, and the very networks he had manipulated began to see through his patterns. The fallout demonstrated a crucial truth. Manipulation can only succeed while perception is controlled, and once truth emerges, it cannot be undone. In the following weeks, I observed the gradual restoration of my own reputation. Professional credibility returned, social bonds strengthened, and trust began to rebuild. The fallout, once a source of anxiety and tension, had become a testament to the power of patience, preparation, and strategic action. I had turned the chaos of deception into a structured triumph of clarity. Yet amidst the visible effects of the fallout, I felt an even deeper, quieter victory. I had reclaimed my narrative, asserted my truth, and demonstrated that lies, no matter how carefully woven, cannot withstand consistent, precise exposure. The fallout was not only about the reactions of others, it was a personal affirmation of my ability to navigate adversity, confront deception, and emerge stronger. In reflecting on this period, I understood that fallout is inevitable when deception is confronted. It is messy, uncomfortable, and emotionally charged, but it is also necessary. The ripple effects, the recalibration of perception, and the gradual restoration of truth are all part of the process. And through it, I had discovered an essential truth. Preparation, observation, and strategic action are the most powerful tools against manipulation. The fallout was a complex tapestry of emotions, revelations, and adjustments, but at its core, it was a testament to truth. Lies may thrive in silence, but when confronted methodically, they unravel. The relationships strained by manipulation began to recalibrate, trust slowly returning and respect being reestablished. The fallout, in its totality, became proof that patience and strategy can overcome even the most insidious deception. And as I looked back on the journey, from the first whispers to the tipping point, from gathering evidence to the confrontation, I realized that the fallout was the final, inevitable stage of a battle I had navigated with clarity, precision, and resilience. The lies had been exposed, the truth had triumphed, and the power to control my life had been reclaimed. I had faced betrayal, manipulation, and subtle, persistent deceit, and emerged victorious. The fallout was not an ending. It was a transformation. The world had shifted, perceptions had been realigned, and I had proven in every measurable way that truth, patience, and strategy could overcome even the most calculated attempts to deceive. The fallout was complete. The battle won. The truth, finally, was undeniable. The fallout had settled, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. The tension that had shadowed every interaction, every meeting, and every conversation began to lift. I had faced deception, manipulation, and betrayal, and had emerged not only unbroken but stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. Now it was time to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of my life that had been clouded by doubt and distrust. Rebuilding was both external and internal. Externally, I focused on repairing relationships, reconnecting with colleagues, friends, and family who had been influenced by his lies. Some interactions required patience, explanation, and understanding. Others required setting boundaries and choosing carefully where to invest my energy. The process was delicate, but it was also empowering. I was not simply reacting, I was curating a life based on truth, trust, and authenticity. Internally, I reflected deeply on what had occurred. The journey from whispers to tipping points, from subtle lies to confrontation, had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and at times terrifying. But it had also been instructive. I had learned that patience is strength, observation is power, and preparation is the foundation of resilience. The experience had transformed me, sharpening my perception and deepening my understanding of human behavior. I spent time considering the manipulations themselves, the patterns, strategies, and subtle tactics he had employed. It was almost astonishing, the level of detail and calculation involved. Yet even as I examined the mechanics of deceit, I could see the flaws, the arrogance, the assumption that no one would notice, the underestimation of my resolve. Every manipulation contained the seeds of its own undoing, and by recognizing them, I had been able to reclaim my narrative. One of the most important aspects of rebuilding was forgiveness, not necessarily for him, but for myself. I had carried guilt, doubt, and self-recrimination for months, questioning whether I had missed signs, ignored warnings, or been naive. I realized that the fault lay not in my perception, but in his calculated deceit. Forgiving myself allowed me to move forward with clarity and confidence, free from the weight of unnecessary self-blame. I also reflected on resilience. The experience had forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities, test my limits, and discover strengths I had not fully acknowledged. I learned that strength is not merely the absence of fear or weakness, but the ability to act decisively and deliberately despite them. I had navigated betrayal with strategy, patience, and composure, and in doing so, I had proven to myself the depth of my own capabilities. Rebuilding included creating boundaries that were clear and unwavering. I had once allowed proximity and trust to cloud judgment, giving him space to manipulate. Now I established limits, social, professional, and emotional, that ensured my autonomy and protected my well-being. Boundaries were not punishment but preservation, a way to safeguard the progress I had fought so hard to achieve. The process was gradual, unfolding in small but meaningful steps. I reconnected with friends who had been cautious, engaged with colleagues who had been uncertain, and reached out to family members who had been inadvertently influenced by misinformation. Each interaction reinforced trust, clarity, and respect. The cumulative effect was a restored sense of equilibrium and a reaffirmation of my identity and integrity. Reflection also led to gratitude. I was grateful for my own vigilance, for the patience I had cultivated, and for the clarity that allowed me to see patterns and plan with precision. I was grateful for the allies who had quietly observed and supported me, even without knowing the full extent of the situation. And I was grateful for the lessons that, painful as they were, had strengthened my resilience and deepened my understanding of human behavior. As I rebuilt my life, I also recognized the importance of narrative. The story we tell ourselves and others shapes perception, influences behavior, and defines reality. By reclaiming my narrative, I had not only exposed deception, but also reaffirmed my own authority, credibility, and autonomy. The experience had demonstrated that truth, when paired with careful strategy, can overpower manipulation, even in the most subtle and insidious forms. I took time to reflect on personal growth. The ordeal had demanded courage, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence. It had taught me that adversity is not merely an obstacle, but an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. I'd been forced to examine relationships, assess character, and navigate complexity with clarity. In the end, the experience had strengthened my sense of self and deepened my confidence in my ability to handle future challenges. Part of rebuilding was also about forward movement. I recognized that dwelling on the past or focusing on lingering resentment would be counterproductive. Instead, I directed my energy toward meaningful endeavors, work, personal projects, and relationships that reflected trust, integrity, and mutual respect. By prioritizing these areas, I reinforced the stability and authenticity that had been threatened, ensuring that the lessons learned translated into tangible growth. I also reflected on vigilance, the ongoing awareness that deception can arise in subtle forms, often when least expected. The experience had taught me to trust my instincts, observe carefully, and document when necessary. These skills were not just protective measures, they were tools for empowerment. By maintaining vigilance, I could ensure that my reclaimed life remained secure and that manipulation could never again take root unnoticed. Finally, I considered legacy. Beyond the immediate fallout and personal triumph, the journey had left a lasting impression on how I approached relationships, trust, and strategy. I had demonstrated to myself, and quietly to others, the importance of patience, careful observation, and methodical action. The experience was a testament to the strength of truth and the resilience of the human spirit when armed with awareness and preparation. In the quiet moments of reflection, I acknowledged the full arc of the journey, from betrayal to tipping point, from strategic planning to confrontation, and through the cascading effects of fallout, I had navigated a complex web of deceit and emerged not only victorious, but transformed. I had reclaimed control, restored my credibility, and fortified my sense of self. Rebuilding and reflection were not merely the final chapters, they were the culmination of months of vigilance, strategy, and perseverance. The experience had been a crucible, testing emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and personal strength. And as I moved forward, I did so with clarity, confidence, and a profound understanding of the power of truth. Because in the end, rebuilding is not just about restoration. It is about growth, empowerment, and the unshakable knowledge that truth, patience, and strategy can overcome even the most calculated deception. And I had proven it. Looking back, the journey from betrayal to triumph was as much an internal transformation as it was a confrontation with external deception. The lies, the subtle manipulations, and the calculated distortions had tested every aspect of my patience, strategy, and emotional resilience. Yet through careful observation, meticulous documentation, and deliberate action, I emerged stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than I had ever been. One of the first lessons I learned is that vigilance is power. Small lies, when ignored, can evolve into something destructive, capable of reshaping perception and isolating those who are targeted. Recognizing early signs of deception, documenting inconsistencies, and observing patterns allowed me to regain control before the situation escalated beyond my influence. Vigilance is not paranoia, it is preparation, and preparation is empowerment. Another lesson is the importance of patience. It would have been easy to react impulsively, to confront him immediately, or to allow anger to dictate my actions. But patience allowed me to observe, understand, and plan. It gave me the clarity to see the patterns, anticipate responses, and construct a strategy that would be decisive. Acting too soon would have been reckless. Acting too late could have allowed the manipulation to solidify. Patience, when coupled with careful planning, is a powerful tool. Strategic action is another critical takeaway. Observing and documenting lies is important, but it must be paired with thoughtful execution. The confrontation had to be precise, controlled, and deliberate. Every word, every piece of evidence, and every witness had to be carefully considered. Strategy transforms vulnerability into power, and it allows truth to prevail over manipulation. Without strategy, exposure risks being diluted or misrepresented. I also learned the value of clarity in communication. Lies thrive in ambiguity, in the space between perception and fact. By presenting information clearly, logically, and systematically, I was able to dismantle the narrative he had constructed. The precision of presentation left no room for doubt, no space for misinterpretation, and no opportunity for manipulation. Clarity is a weapon in the arsenal of truth. Boundaries proved to be essential. Before the deception was exposed, I had allowed proximity, trust, and routine to create openings for manipulation. Reestablishing boundaries, social, professional, and emotional, was critical to maintaining control and protecting my well-being. Boundaries are not punishment, they are preservation. They ensure that trust is earned and that vulnerability does not become a tool for exploitation. Resilience emerged as both a necessity and a revelation. Emotional strength, coupled with strategic thinking, allowed me to navigate the uncertainty and tension created by deception. Resilience is not the absence of fear or doubt, it is the ability to act decisively in their presence. Each step, from gathering evidence to confronting him and witnessing the fallout, was a testament to the depth of my own resilience. The journey also emphasized the importance of perspective. Observing his behavior, understanding the motivations behind his lies, and recognizing the patterns of manipulation allowed me to approach the situation analytically rather than purely emotionally. Perspective transforms frustration into insight, chaos into structure, and vulnerability into opportunity. Understanding the broader picture provided the clarity necessary for decisive action. I discovered the significance of personal agency. The lies had attempted to undermine my credibility, isolate me, and shape the narrative in his favor. By taking control of my own story, documenting evidence, and executing a careful strategy, I reclaimed agency. Agency is the recognition that, even in the face of manipulation, we have the power to shape outcomes, assert truth, and protect our integrity. Forgiveness, too, became a profound lesson. I did not forgive him for his sake, but for mine. Carrying guilt, self-blame, or lingering resentment only served to weaken my focus and cloud my judgment. Forgiving myself for past naivety and for having been manipulated allowed me to move forward with clarity, confidence, and emotional freedom. Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is liberation. Another reflection is the power of evidence. Lies, no matter how charmingly presented, crumble when met with careful documentation. Dates, witness statements, messages, and observed patterns became the backbone of my strategy. Evidence transforms perception from opinion to fact and allows truth to prevail where charisma or manipulation once held sway. I also recognize the transformative power of confrontation. Confrontation is not inherently about anger or revenge. It is about presenting truth decisively. When executed strategically, with clarity, evidence, and composure, confrontation dismantles deception, restores credibility, and reshapes perception. It is an essential tool for reclaiming agency and asserting justice in situations of manipulation. Rebuilding relationships and restoring trust was another vital aspect of the journey. The fallout from deception rippled outward, affecting colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. Patiently restoring trust, reconnecting with allies, and clarifying misunderstandings allowed my social and professional networks to recalibrate. Rebuilding is a careful, deliberate process that requires transparency, consistency, and emotional intelligence. Ultimately, the journey reinforced the idea that truth is inexorable. Lies may grow silently and subtly, but systematic observation, strategic planning, and clear presentation allow truth to prevail. The arc from manipulation to exposure, from confrontation to fallout, demonstrates that patience, clarity, and resilience can overcome even the most calculated attempts at deceit. Reflection also highlighted the personal growth that emerged from the ordeal. I had been tested emotionally, intellectually, and socially, and I had risen to the challenge. The experience revealed strengths I had not fully acknowledged, honed my analytical abilities, and deepened my understanding of human behavior. Growth is often born from adversity, and in this journey, it was undeniable. As I close this chapter of my life, I carry with me the lessons learned: vigilance, patience, strategic action, clarity, boundaries, resilience, perspective, personal agency, forgiveness, the power of evidence, the value of confrontation, and the importance of rebuilding. These lessons are not abstract. They are practical tools, forged in experience, and applicable to any situation where manipulation or deception may arise. The final reflection is simple. Deception may attempt to control perception, distort reality, and isolate the vulnerable. But truth, when met with patience, strategy, and resilience, is unstoppable. Lies may thrive temporarily, but truth endures, and those who confront it methodically emerge stronger, wiser, and in control. I had walked the long, challenging path from betrayal to triumph, and in doing so, I had discovered not only the power of truth, but also the strength within myself. I had navigated manipulation with precision, reclaimed my narrative, and rebuilt a life grounded in authenticity and clarity. And as I look forward, I know that the lessons learned, the resilience forged, and the strength reclaimed will continue to guide me. Because truth, patience, and strategy are not just tools, they are lifelines, ensuring that no deception can ever hold sway over a prepared, vigilant, and empowered mind. I had been tested, I had endured, and I had prevailed. And in that, I found not only resolution, but peace.